In previous videos, we've looked at different types of market failure, and in this one, we're going to look at how governments can deal with market failure in a mixed economy. And let's just remind ourselves, when we talk about a mixed economy, we're talking about an economy where both the private sector, private individuals and businesses, and the public sector, government, contribute to the economy. So, in this video, we're going to look at a number of different ways in which governments tend to intervene. Sometimes governments will completely provide services. Sometimes they will subsidise private businesses to encourage them to provide more of a particular service. And at other times, the government will get involved by perhaps setting minimum prices or maximum prices in a particular market, or by taxing goods, or just by having regulations or giving consumers information. So we're going to look at each one of these in a little bit more detail, starting with government provision. So earlier on in the week, we looked at the idea of public goods. Do you remember those? Public goods, the ones which the market is unlikely to ever provide. Things like street lighting, because do you remember those things? We're unlikely to buy street lighting because we can't stop other people using it. That thing about excludability, non-excludability, non-rivalry. So things like street lighting the government will definitely provide, but in different countries, governments will provide other things as well. Sometimes governments will provide not just public goods, but merit goods. So for example, in the UK, the government will provide education. The government also in the UK provides healthcare through the National Health Service, and that's common in many countries. In most countries, it's the government that builds roads, isn't it? So we're talking about infrastructure here, and again, in most countries, it's the government that supplies power to people and to businesses. Water and waste disposal, again, something that's often provided by government. Other infrastructure, transport infrastructure such as rail and even airports, are often provided by government. So some of these are missing markets, but some of these are just markets that tend to be under-provided by the private sector. And in both cases, governments will provide. But this is often a political decision about how much of these things the government will provide. So, for example, we see in the United States at the moment lots of debate about to what extent the government should provide healthcare for the American people, and to what extent those people should provide healthcare for themselves. Okay, so governments will often provide, but in many cases the governments won't actually provide the service. Instead, the government will give money to private companies to encourage those companies to produce a good or a service. And this is what we call a subsidy. The government provides money to encourage production, that's a subsidy. So we're thinking here about perhaps things like green energy. If our government wants to encourage suppliers to produce more sustainable fuel like biofuel or wind farms, the government will often subsidise producers to encourage them to do that. In the UK, the government subsidises childcare. This is seen as a merit good because it enables parents to go out to work, and it can be very expensive, particularly for people on low incomes. So the government will subsidises that in the UK. The government will often subsidise different forms of education and training, like apprenticeship schemes. Infrastructure projects like rail. Even if rail services or roads are run by private companies, often the government will provide subsidies because it's again seen as a merit good. A good railway system enables not just people to move around the country, but also enables businesses to move their goods around the country. So where there are merit goods, and we remember that merit goods tend to be under-provided by the private sector, governments will often subsidise the production of those merit goods in order to increase provision, so that the whole country can benefit from those social benefits that come as a result of us all having good infrastructure, being well educated, and having sustainable fuels and so on. So what does that look like? We can show a subsidy on an economic diagram. So you see here the market demand for a unit of output, market demand for output, and we also see two supply curves. So we have the original supply curve at the top, and when the government grants a subsidy, the effect of that is that it reduces the cost of production for producers. And we know now, don't we, that if the costs of production fall, then profits will rise. And remember our assumption in economics that if profits rise, businesses will want to supply more. And so a subsidy has the effect of moving the whole supply curve to the right, so that more is supplied at any price. And so we see here that at price 1, the quantity 1 is supplied to the market, but after the subsidy, the price falls and quantity 2 is supplied to the market. So the quantity supplied to the market is now increased. It doesn't necessarily increase, though, by the same amount of the subsidy. We see the subsidy shown as the vertical distance between the original supply curve and the new supply curve. The amount of that subsidy that gets passed on to the consumer really depends on the elasticity of the market demand. Okay, the other thing that government might do is impose a minimum or a maximum price control on the market. Why might they do this? Well, let's have a look first at minimum price, or sometimes we call this a price floor. So we see in this first diagram that we have a market equilibrium price at PE. However, if we set the price higher, we say that there is a minimum price. This will encourage suppliers to come into the market and increase supply. However, we've learnt about this before, haven't we? And we understand now that the problem with this minimum price, when you say that the lowest price that can be charged is higher than the equilibrium, we end up with a surplus. So what happens then? Well, in some markets, the government will actually buy up that surplus. Why would they do that? Well, let's take the example of the production of an essential food like rice, for example. The problem with agricultural goods like rice is that the price tends to fluctuate from one year to the next because weather conditions might mean that more is produced or less is produced. When much more is produced, the price of rice tends to fall dramatically. And when this happens, if we leave it to the market, what will happen is the price of rice will fall. So when we get an increase in the production of rice, the price is likely to fall. And as a result of that fall in price, some farmers might say, well, I'm not going to produce any rice anymore. I'm going to switch to something else. Now that's fine until we get to the following year and all of a sudden there is a shortage of rice and the price goes up and people go hungry. And this is where governments tend to intervene by setting a minimum price. But the result of that, of course, is that they have to buy up the surplus. And this is very difficult for governments to get right, but they do sometimes do it. A maximum price, on the other hand, is where government sets a price ceiling. So the price is set lower than the equilibrium price. Again, why would they do that? Well, one of the most common applications of a maximum price is in housing. Many of us live in cities where the cost of housing is very expensive and often out of the reach of people who are on low incomes. Therefore, to avoid homelessness, the government might set a maximum price and say that the maximum price that can be charged for the rental of a flat is this much. And that's great. Demand goes up. Everyone can now afford a roof over their head. Everyone can afford to get somewhere to live. But again, the problem we've learned about before is that this lower price tends to put off suppliers, and supply often will go down, and we get a shortage of housing. So a maximum price like this is okay, again, if government is prepared to step in and start building houses on its own and increase the supply in that way. But if the government can't increase supply, then a maximum price is unlikely to work very well. So what are the effects of these kinds of price controls? Well, one of the criticisms is that price controls distort the price signal, and so they can prevent the market signals from working properly. So, for example, we spoke about housing. The price is low, that's going to deter suppliers. However, there is still that big demand for housing. And so it often leads to surpluses, as we've seen, or shortages. And those minimum prices mean that government has to buy up production, surplus production. So the next government intervention that we're going to have a look at is indirect tax. And when we talk about indirect tax, what we mean is a tax that is imposed on producers or suppliers by the government on particular goods. So examples of this might include duties on cigarettes or alcohol or fuel, but also a general sort of purchase tax like VAT. That we also see things like carbon taxes in order to deter businesses from using fossil fuels. But the thing about an indirect tax is it's always a specific tax levied on a specific good or a service. So let's have a little bit more of a look how indirect taxes work and what they are. So a tax increases the cost of production, and because it increases the cost of production, it's the opposite to a subsidy. It causes an inward shift in the supply curve, a shift to the left. Just like with a subsidy, we can measure the amount of the indirect tax on a diagram by looking at the vertical distance between the two supply curves, before the tax and after the tax. Now, with an indirect tax, the supplier might be able to pass on some of that tax to the consumer through a higher price, or sometimes even all of the tax. And we call this idea shifting the burden of the tax. But again, the ability of businesses to put that burden of tax onto the consumer depends on the price elasticity of demand and supply. So let's look at that here. In the first diagram, the one on the left, this shows elastic demand. The elasticity of demand is greater than 1. If demand is elastic, then most of the burden of an indirect tax will be carried by the supplier. Why is that? Well, basically it's because an indirect tax has the effect of pushing the price up. And when the price of a good or a service increases, if we can find a substitute, an alternative as consumers, we will do. And therefore, there's a limit to how much of this tax the business can pass on to the consumer in the price, because the supplier knows that if he puts all of that tax onto the price, then consumers will go elsewhere because there are alternatives, there are substitutes. On the other hand, the second diagram on the right-hand side shows inelastic demand. We see a very steep demand curve here. This could be a diagram for something like tobacco or maybe even oil. Both of those have inelastic demand because there are not very good substitutes. And in the case of inelastic demand, we can see from this diagram that actually it's possible for the producer to pass on most of that tax to the consumer in the price. And again, that's because in this case there aren't many substitutes. So we've all seen, I think, even those of us who are non-smokers, we've seen that in most countries the price of cigarettes has gone up and up and up. And that's mostly because of the tax imposed on cigarettes by governments. But many smokers continue to buy those cigarettes even with a really high price because they have that addiction. Some will stop, but many continue. Therefore, when demand is inelastic, it's much more possible for suppliers to pass on that tax to consumers within the price. So the last form of intervention that we're going to look at is this idea of government regulation and government information. So keeping with the topic of smoking, we see now in most countries that governments have outlawed smoking in many, many public places. In the UK, for example, you are not allowed to smoke in public places that are inside. Take things like tanning salons or drinking alcohol, minimum age laws. So the government understands that using tanning machines or consuming alcohol, these are demerit goods. They have negative externalities. The government is trying to stop particularly young people from using these things because we don't want young people to develop those habits for their lifetime. Therefore, minimum age laws are a good way of preventing or minimising the number of young people who will use those things. In the UK, we have regulations about the maximum emissions for vehicles. And if you have a car that's over 3 or 4 years old, every year you need to get it tested by law. And part of that test is to check the emissions. Recycling. Again, in the UK, there are lots of regulations around recycling. Many goods in the UK we are not allowed to just throw away anymore. We have to recycle them, and we have to recycle them in a specific way. Speed limits on the roads. Fishing quotas to preserve the fish stocks in our seas. All of these are examples of the way in which governments regulate markets, mostly in order to reduce the negative externalities, in other words, the cost to society as a whole. If we can regulate to keep the speed down, then there will be fewer road traffic collisions and fewer injuries and deaths as a result. The other type of regulation that happens in most countries is regulation of competition. So in the UK, we have a Competition and Markets Authority. This is a government body, and the job of the CMA is to regulate monopolies, to try and ensure that monopolies, and to some extent oligopolies, to try and ensure that those businesses are not exploiting their market power, to try to prevent those businesses from charging excessively high prices to consumers who have a little choice because there are a few substitutes. And the final way that government tends to regulate markets is to provide information. So again, in the UK, the government provides all sorts of information to consumers to try to give us information that is closer to perfect information, because in many cases, as we've learned, we have imperfect information, and that leads us to make poor choices, really. And therefore it leads to an inefficient allocation of resources, and it can lead to negative externalities. So, for example, health warnings on cigarettes. There was a time when there were no health warnings on cigarettes. People were not really aware that smoking cigarettes were bad for you. Well, I think that's changed significantly now. I think we all understand the dangers of smoking, and that is in large part due to the information provided by governments across the world. Similarly, more recently, We see a move by many governments to put detailed labelling on food to try and prevent, for one thing, the obesity epidemic. So in the UK, certainly, every time you buy food that's packaged, you will see nutritional labelling, which will tell you how much fat, how much sugar, how much salt. It helps us to make more rational choices, and it helps us to minimise those negative externalities. Many countries have a big gambling industry, and the UK is no exception to that. And the UK government runs information campaigns to try and raise awareness amongst consumers of the possible danger of gambling, and it does that in other industries as well. And then in many industries there are standards imposed on suppliers, so that suppliers are forced to adhere to particular safety standards or otherwise, in order to ensure that products are not dangerous and that products give benefits to consumers rather than negative outcomes. Okay, so what have we learnt? Well, we've learnt that in missing markets, or markets where there is under provision of merit goods, the government will often provide goods or services itself, as in the case of education or healthcare, or sometimes the government will subsidise, give money to private firms to encourage them to increase their supply of something that has positive externality. The government will also regulate and inform and control prices. We've also learnt that in markets where there is an over-provision of demerit goods, governments are likely to tax those goods, or again they might regulate to limit the harms, or they will inform the public, and again they might control prices. Finally, where there's a lack of competition, again the government might impose maximum prices, but most often they will regulate, and sometimes they will intervene to break up and monitor monopolies. Okay, we will finish there. There are now a few questions for you to answer.